are continuing through 1 John this morning. The last few weeks we've been looking at kind of the second half of chapter 1, and a couple of weeks ago specifically we looked at confession, and of course confessing our sins described in 1:9, and also some of the reasons why, kind of going through 2:2 over the last 2 or 3 sessions. And today I want to start looking at kind of the section starting in chapter 2, verse 3. So we've been looking at chapter 1 and the first couple verses of chapter 2. John has been focused on sin, and we've seen a few things in summary. We've seen John point out that sin is still present. It's still a potential with us. We've seen in 1:8, for example, he says, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. And again in verse 10, if we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar and his word is not in us. And he writes these things, as it says in 2:1, so that they do not sin. And so obviously not impossible for them to do so. And this is also important related to the truth. And the truth is a term we will see. We will see it again in the next context that we're going to be dealing with for the next few lessons. But in 1:6, he says, if we say we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and are not doing the truth. And we also saw this in 1:8 as well. And so the importance of understanding that we do still sin, and that we do have sin and have a sin nature, is not simply because that's true, but also because that is actually going to uh, prevent us from having victory over sin in the first place. And uh, obviously, we can understand the difficulty with um, taking steps to defend yourself against something that you deny is real. And he also goes over the forgiveness of sins and the fact that we are forgiven of these sins. And we went over those things in the last few sessions. Now, starting in 2:3, we're going to see a bit of a pivot, although there's some similarities. We're going to see a bit of a pivot from focusing on dealing with sins to now focusing on dealing with uh, commandments. He says in 2:3, and hereby we know that we have known him if we keep his commandments. And he goes on to say, he who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly is the love of God perfected. By this we know that we are in him. He who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk even as he walked. Brethren, I do not write a new commandment to you, but an old commandment which you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard from the beginning. Again, I write a new commandment to you, which thing is true in him and in you, because the darkness is past and the true light now shines. And so we have this shift, but John is continuing with dealing with things that are fundamental to how a Christian is to live, and having looked at uh, just some of the most basic things with sin, so that they sin not. Now we're looking some at commandments and the importance he attaches to this. In verse 3, he says, "By this we know that we have known him, if we keep his commandments." And you can see the importance attached to it in this context. So what I want to do today is uh, we're going to spend a little time, obviously beyond just this morning, looking at what is said here, but I want to focus today a little bit on commandments, uh, the word commandments itself, and give a little more definition to what John is referring to. We're not going to come up with a list. What we're going to see is, and we're going to see why when we get to 1 Corinthians 14, but want to look a little bit at commandments, and then in the next couple sessions we'll talk about uh, commandments and look at what John says about keeping them. When it comes to the word commandment, another place we see this mentioned in the writings of John is in the Gospel of John in the upper room. And of course, Jesus mentions some of these. Let's go to chapter 14. And we'll look at a few different places where Jesus speaks of keeping his commandments. In 14:15, he says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And so there's a straightforward statement. And again, the word commandments is plural, as it was in 1 John 2:3. And so it is plural here also. Again, down in verse 21, Jesus says, "And he who has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will manifest myself to him." And so we can see this being linked to loving God here in these two verses, verse 15 and verse 21. And also, of course, verse 21 mentions being loved by God. And then over in chapter 15, we have a couple more spots where Jesus mentions this. In 15:9, he says, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Continue or abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love." And then if we move down to verse 14, he says, "You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. Henceforth I do not call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his Lord does, but I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you will ask of the Father in my character, he will give it to you. These things I command you in order that you love one another." And so we see this concept presented in the upper room and linked to love uh, quite frequently. And that is something we will look at as we go through First John and this particular passage in First John chapter 2. And so we see the importance that's attached to it. Now, I want to focus on being a little more specific or give a little more idea as to what is being talked about with commandments, because as Christians, when we think of commandment, what comes to mind is the new commandment. But this word for commandment has been plural, commandments. Uh, John has said uh, in 2, 3, and 4, he's talked about keeping commandments. We know him if we keep his commandments, and whoever says, "I know him," and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. And those words are plural, multiple commandments. And so let's just take a quick look at some things that are called commandments in the New Testament, because it is more than just simply the new commandment. Now, of course, the new commandment is part of it, and over in John 13:34, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another." And of course, this is new because under the law, the commandment that was similar but not the same was that to love one another as you love yourself. And so here we kind of have a different standard given love one another as I have loved you, is what Jesus tells his disciples. And so, and this is a new commandment, and we call it the new commandment. But we do see multiple commandments mentioned, and we talked about First John chapter 2. We also see in First John chapter 3 this mentioned as well, with multiple commandments. And of course, in First John, we kind of deal with uh, cyclical structure in the book of First John, where John kind of goes back over and builds on what he's talked about before, and kind of repeats things and circles back on uh, some of the subjects, some of the same subjects. So in chapter 3, verse 22, he comes back to some things about commandments. And in the last three verses of chapter 3, he says, "And whatever we ask, we receive from him, because we keep his commandments and do those things that are pleasing in his sight." And this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandment. And he who keeps his commandments dwells in him, abides in him, and he in him. And hereby we know that he abides in us by the Spirit which he has given us. Now, let's be clear about what a commandment is. It's you're simply telling or commanding somebody to do something. Under the law, um, and we'll bring this distinction up more in a moment, but under the law, you have a lot of laws that don't simply tell somebody to do something, not to do something, but there's also a penalty or a punishment with breaking the law. There might be a reward for following it. And in the case of a commandment, this is just simply a command given. Jesus gave the instruction, love one another as I have loved you, and that is a commandment. But we can also see commandments given through the apostles. We can look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 14. This is chapter 14, not chapter 4. In 1 Corinthians 14:37, in this chapter, this context, Paul is dealing with spiritual gifts and specifically how they're being used in the church at Corinth. And unfortunately, when it comes to some of these gifts that involve speaking, uh, such as the gift of prophecy, the gift of tongues, uh, the Corinthians were doing this in such a disorganized and confusing manner that everyone was just speaking all at the same time. And Paul tells them, gives them some instruction about who is, you know, to be speaking during the service, essentially, and trying to give some order, restore some order to what was going on in the Corinthian church. And after giving all this instruction, he says in verse 37, if any man thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things I write to you are a commandment from the Lord. And so Paul refers to uh, what he has written as a commandment of or from the Lord. Uh, and so the reason the word commandment is plural in 1 John 2, and we see commandments, keep his commandments, is we do understand we are told in the New Testament, we are told more about how we are to conduct ourselves more than simply love one another as I have loved you. There is more than just the new commandment. Uh, for example, well, I could think of a ton of examples. Reflectively think on things above is not a suggestion. It's not, well, if you feel like it, walk by the Spirit so that you don't fulfill desires from the flesh. Um, and so we understand that in the Word of God, Christians are told uh, there are some things that we need to do. And so the next question, and I want to make this distinction because we go here to First John, we see him talk about uh, keeping commandments, and we see a number of things linked to it. And these things that are linked to it in chapter 2, we will explore in the next couple lessons. Uh, we know that we have known him if we keep his commandments. If we don't keep his commandments, the truth is not in us. Whoever keeps his word, in him the love of God is perfected, and by this we know we are in him. And he who says he abides in him ought to walk as he walked. And so some fairly important sounding things attached to this. So when we deal with commandments, are we dealing with the law? Because someone might say, well, commandment is, that sounds kind of similar to law. So let's look over Hebrews chapter 7 and just make this dispensational distinction here in a couple of places. Hebrews 7:11, we'll read 11 through 19 and pick up this passage dealing with the priesthood having been changed um, from a Levitical priesthood under the law to Christ being a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And we'll see what he says in connection with this. So Hebrews 7:11 says, if therefore perfection or maturity and perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertains to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses said nothing concerning priesthood. Again, all the priests were of one specific tribe of the 12, the tribe of Levi, and Christ is not of the tribe of Levi. And so he cannot be a priest according to the order of Aaron, the Levitical priesthood. Verse 15 says, and it is yet far more evident, for that according to the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another priest, who is made not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. For there is truly a disannulling of the commandment going beforehand because of the weakness and unprofitableness of it. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, through which we draw near to God. And so, again, as we understand the concept of dispensations taught here and in other places, there is a change in the household, there is a change in the house rule. Um, and so, what commandments we do have as Christians, the new commandment, whatever Christians are instructed to do, is not the same as what Israel was instructed to do under the law. And as an example, in 1 Corinthians 7:19, Paul speaks about circumcision, uh, and here uh, pointing out that circumcision does not matter. He says in verse 18, is any man called circumcised, being circumcised, let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision, let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments of God. Which is interesting because circumcision was a commandment from God. Uh, all the way back to Abraham. Abraham was told by God to circumcise himself and his offspring. But here, Paul says circumcision doesn't matter. What matters is keeping the commandments from God. So obviously, we're dealing with a different commandments. We're not dealing with what was commanded of Israel under the law. And so just to point that out, I'm sure you're familiar with that, but uh, commandments deals with what we are told as Christians. And one of the things linked to commandments is the truth. And we've pointed this out already in First John in multiple places, and we've already been dealing with the truth in chapter 1 and how it is linked to, uh, for example, somebody who denies that they have sinned is unable to do the truth. And we also see this with in 2:4, where he says, "He who says, I know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him." And uh, I want to point out why, just a couple things about why it's important to not confuse which commandments we're referring to, which dispensation we're drawing commandments from. Over in Romans 7, we'll go to a couple places. In Romans chapter 7, Paul has just finished going over, he's been going over in the previous chapter, uh, how one has victory over the sin nature. And just by way of review, it involves knowing that we have died to the sin nature, reckoning it to indeed be so, and then yielding our members as instruments of um, as yielding ourselves to God rather than as instruments of unrighteousness. So there we have the know, reckon, and yield. In chapter 7, though, we see Paul describe an issue with uh, dealing with the flesh. And he says in, let's see, let's pick up verse 7. He links this to the law. And of course, Paul was born during the dispensation of law. He was raised a Jew. He was dealing with the law uh, until he became a Christian. But unfortunately, after he became a Christian, he would still deal with the law at times, and we see his experience described in chapter 7. In verse 7, he says, "What shall we say then? Is the law a sin? May it never be. No, I would not have known sin except through law, except for I had not known desire, except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet." But these sin, and again, this is articular like it is in chapter 6, not dealing with sinfulness in general, but a particular sinful quality. And in this case, he's describing the principle of the sin nature. In verse 8, "But these sin, taking occasion by the commandment, worked in me all manner of lust, every desire. For without the law, sin was dead." And the occasion was taken by the commandment here in verse 8. And he says, "For I was alive without law once, but when the commandment came, the sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life I found to be unto death. For the sin nature taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, righteous, and good. Was then that which is good made death unto me? May it never be. But rather the sin, that it might appear sin, worked death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful." And there's a few different reasons, but this is a major reason why we don't try to live under law because uh, we are provided something better, something that actually consistently works, uh, which is the truth, when it comes to dealing with our sin nature. And we see that point back up in verse 6, because he starts this by saying in verse 6, but now we are delivered from the law, that being dead in what we were held, we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. And the Galatians also had this issue as well, and I'll just read Galatians 5 very quickly. Um, the Galatians were also trying to, like Paul did in chapter 7, Galatians 5, well, the whole book of Galatians deals with this problem that the Galatians were trying to live under the law as if they were under the law. And so in 5:3, Paul says, I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ has become of no effect to you, whoever of you are justified by law, you are fallen from grace. For we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision avails anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith, which works by love. You did run well. Who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth, or just truth in this case? So, this issue with the difference between the dispensation of law and the dispensation of grace is not that God no longer expects anything of us when it comes to our behavior or manner of life. We don't live as though God has no standard for our behavior. The difference is in how we go about doing that. We do that, we're living under grace, not under law. And the problem the Galatians had was not believing that God had some standard for their behavior, but in how they went about trying to live their present tense salvation and trying to live it by the law rather than simply um, by what was being revealed to them and what at this point we have revealed to us in the New Testament about um, how we can take advantage of the fact that we have present tense salvation available to us and not something that's going to produce the frustrations described in Romans chapter 7. And so in a couple of weeks, we'll continue looking through this context in 1 John 2 and look at a little more closely at some of the things that he says about what happens when we keep the commandments or don't keep the commandments and why uh, these things are important.